Good day, gentlemen. James Marshall here. Today, I am very proud and excited to announce that I've got a special guest joining us, the one, the only, Dr. Orion Taraban. Say hello.
Hi, James. So great to be here. I've been a fan of your work for quite some time. It's a treat to talk to you. So I hope we have a great conversation today.
And I feel also exactly the same. I came across your material, I think about a year ago when I was spending quite a bit of time at my farm, and I binged your stuff for days. And I thought it was excellent. And so I'm really glad that we can finally get in touch and share some cool knowledge with my guys. Um,
Right on.
So, first thing for guys who don't know me, if you can introduce yourself, tell them what you do, and a bit about yourself and what you've been doing in terms of men's work.
Sure. So I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of California. I live in Napa, outside of the Bay Area right now. I've worked in private practice for about 8 years. And in my private practice, I specialized in men's mental health. All of my patients were guys. About 3.5 years ago, I started a YouTube channel called Psychax, in which I had the intention to bring some of the insights and interventions that seemed to be working with the men with whom I was consulting to a larger audience. I thought it might be a shame to keep certain things to myself and the 30 confidential relationships I had every year. If they helped those 30 guys, I didn't see why they wouldn't necessarily help 30 million. So I wanted to potentially bring this to a larger platform. And through some luck and some hard work, it kind of took off about 2 years ago or so. And now I know about you and you know about me, and kind of here we are.
Exactly. Yes, and your channel has dwarfed mine in a short amount of time. I was checking our stats. I'm like, oh, he's kicking my ass in there, which so props because it's been really impressive seeing your channel taking off.
Well, thanks, James. I publish really consistently. That's been one of
Mm.
my hallmarks. So I haven't missed a publication day since I started 3.5 years ago. So it's a
He's
constant
he's
grind.
he's doing the hustle and paying off. So today, what I wanted to talk to you about, because we had a bit of a chat the other day about some of the ideas of what we could talk about. Obviously, my expertise being in the dating, approaching, sexuality kind of realms, and you in terms of what's going on inside this machine of ours. And we talked about discussing personality disorders and how to be aware of them. I think both in yourself, for starters, but particularly when it comes to men dating women. As you know, I recently had a pretty traumatic experience with a breakup where I found out that the person I was dating was not who they said they were, to say the least, and was clearly suffering from an extreme personality disorder and was very, very good at lying. And so I thought it'd be good to bring you on today to talk about like what are some red flags to look out for? What are some of the personality disorders that are relatively common? How they might show up in women, and what some things that men may need to know about in order to, let's say, protect themselves. Um, from my cursory civilian reading of these subjects, which I've been educating myself on, I mean, over years, but more so recently, looking at things such as narcissism, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. What are they? How do they show up? Would be a good place to start.
Okay, yeah, a really interesting topic. Personality disorders are very different from a lot of the mental illnesses that people are subject to experiencing throughout their lifetime. A lot of those other mental illnesses, let's say depression or anxiety, one of the dirty secrets of the profession is they tend to spontaneously remit, even without therapy or medication. That's not really true about personality disorders. Personality disorders are generally chronic, lifelong. They might not ever disappear entirely, but there is evidence to suggest that people with enough treatment and willingness and skills can kind of learn to manage it if they so desire. I worked for a couple of years in an outpatient setting that specialized in the treatment of specifically borderline personality disorder. I was trained in dialectic behavior therapy, which is, as far as I know, the only empirically validated treatment for BPD, borderline. It's wonderful. It was created by a clinician named Marsha Linehan, who is a self professed recovered borderline herself. So she kind of knows it from the inside out. It's an incredibly comprehensive treatment, and it seems to work more than anything else in this population. So I have some experience working with borderlines in a clinical context, and I've studied personality disorders yeah, to a large extent through my education training and just because they're fascinating, really. Now, there's actually in the DSM, there's 10 official personality disorders, and there are three different clusters. So there's a lot of overlap between the disorders in the same cluster. And the ones that you mentioned are all in cluster B. There's four in cluster B. There's borderline, narcissistic, antisocial, and histrionic. And there's a lot of overlap. And they call cluster B, let's say I think they're called the exploitative personality disorders. Getting into a relationship with a woman who has a cluster A or C personality disorder might be difficult, but it's not nearly as destructive or dangerous as getting involved with a person who has a cluster B personality disorder. The really difficult thing about personality disorders is that within the subjective experience of the person with the disorder, there is no problem with themselves. That's because the personality is disordered. It's like the perception that's looking out into the world is so fundamentally warped that there's not enough clarity and insight to wrap that back around to see that, wait a minute, I actually am the common denominator here. Some people do get to that eventually where it's like they can't keep a relationship. They've been fired by every job. They have conflictual relationships with their family members. Their friends have turned their backs on them. It's like at some point, sometimes people say, I actually am the common denominator in all these relationships. Maybe there's something that I'm contributing to these relationships. But until then, it's that my ex was a narcissist and my father was an emotionally abusive withholder and my friends are actually just envious of my beauty and success, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the clearest red flags for cluster B personality disorders is what we call externalizing. An externalizer is a very, very, very difficult person to have an intimate relationship with because they see the locus of their emotions outside of themselves. It's not that it's you made me mad. It's not that there was something inside of me that your words resonated with to create this kind of co-created experience, and I chose to validate and express my anger. It's you did this to me. And you notice that there's kind of a victimizing mindset to that, as well as a strange passivity. The world just impinges on externalizers. They have sort of abdicated their locus of control. And what they want to, but they're still like being influenced by external reality all the time. So this is making them angry. This is making them sad. This is making them glad. It's kind of a really disempowering and unstable experience. And so rather to maintain any kind of emotional equilibrium, externalizers then try to control their external environment because they see that as the origin of their own emotions. And if you're in an intimate relationship with an externalizer, you're going to be a big part of that external environment. So they're going to try to control you. They're going to try to control your words, your actions, because they see that as kind of a form of emotional self-regulation. I can't regulate my emotions directly, but I might be able to regulate you, which I see as the source of my emotions. So that's a big sign of a cluster B personality, externalizing and controlling behavior.
Right. And would you say, is a person in that situation conscious that, are they thinking like, I am going to try and subtly or overtly control this person because that helps me to stabilize my environment? Or is this much more of an unconscious that kind of thing?
It depends. I think that depends on person to person and probably from moment to moment. Like what's interesting is the origin of the word borderline. Do you know where that term comes from? Like why we call those folks borderlines?
No, I don't.
Well, in the old psychoanalytic diagnostics, there are neuroses, which are kind of like, let's say, phobias or generalized anxiety disorders. You're just kind of a little weird. Think Woody Allen kind of a thing. He's the stereotypical neurotic. And then there's psychotics who are hallucinating and not seeing reality clearly and are in a totally separate world. Borderlines are on the border between neurotic and psychotic. Like they have some psychotic beliefs or perceptions, like they're not seeing reality clearly, but they're not so over the edge that they're ranting lunatics. Like they can kind of keep it together and be somewhat functional like the neurotics. That's why they're difficult to spot because they're not like well, not in public anyway. They're generally not ranting and raving. They can do that in
Right.
private.
Or on YouTube.
That's kind of a public, and man, that would be a bad look. I mean, I think it would be tough to keep that up indefinitely. That's why they don't necessarily see it. Marsha Linehan, in her DBT, she forbade, I think that's the right word to use. She forbade the use of the word manipulation, because it's just such a gray zone. And she thought that that was invalidating to the borderline's experience for me to say that you are intentionally doing something just because that's the impact that it has on me. And I can see her point. So I think that sometimes folks with personality disorders are unconsciously defending themselves against perceived threats that may not be real. And sometimes, just like anybody else, they're using emotions to try to get their way.
Right. That's interesting. So if we were to now, could you give a little bit of a definition? So you've talked about what borderline is. So this line between I mean, basically being psychosis, which is seeing and hearing and thinking things that aren't there, more or less. Yeah.
More or less.
And a neurotic is someone who is like Woody Allen, but like, what is that? What are the symptoms of that to be neurotic? I mean, we kind of throw that word around. Someone who's
these aren't real
unreasonable
diagnostic words anymore. They're from like 100 years ago. So you can think of a neurotic as somebody who just has like some issues. You know, maybe he's just a little weird, or she has
very
some daddy
particular
issues
about things.
but they're not like they generally live in the same reality as everybody else.
Right. And then what about, so it's good that we're defining terms, I think, because saying someone's a narcissist that's thrown around a lot, right? So
A lot.
or someone could be doing something that is narcissistic today, but they're not an actual narcissist. So what would define someone who has a personality disorder of narcissism?
Okay, so like officially, there's this manual called the DSM-5, and what you would basically look for is, I think narcissism has 8 or 9 criteria, and if a person displays 5 of those criteria over a prolonged period of time and causes distress or functional impairment, then we can clinically diagnose that person as narcissistic. Now, since we're talking about this potentially in the context of dating and relationships in women, it's kind of interesting to note that there are strong gendered manifestations of these disorders. Like, if you go by the clinical presentation of narcissism, men are overrepresented like 3-1. And if you go by the clinical definition of borderline, women are overrepresented like 4-1. So there's a very strong skewing one way or the other, depending on the gender of the person in question, which has led some people, clinicians, to theorize that those two disorders are really the same disorder that are just manifested differentially because of gendered cultural expression.
Oh,
Like,
wow,
it's
that's
more
interesting.
appropriate for women to overexpress emotion than men, for example. So that's why this kind of disordered personality tends to get manifested in that direction in women. That's one theory anyway.
Whereas for men, like the society giving them permission or encouragement to compete, to be the center of attention, to conquer, that this may then more align with being a narcissist.
Exactly. And what is also important to understand is, and the official literature is starting to catch up with this, but there's some theories that there's many different kinds of narcissism. And the narcissism that's present in the DSM we could call like the grandiose type. So this is generally the guy who's the conqueror of the world, who thinks his shit doesn't stink, he deserves universal fame and all the women that he wants, and all this this kind of over the top emperor mindset, right? And that definitely seems to be gendered more towards men than towards women. But that, in my experience, isn't the only form of narcissism. For example, one of the characteristics of this kind of grandiose narcissism is that you're the exception to every rule. Like, the rules generally don't apply to me. They apply to the peasants and the peons, not the real important
Not
people
Caligula.
like me, right? What's that?
Not Caligula, who gets to set the rules.
No, they are in a a species, a genus of their own, as it were,
Hmm.
right? So they're
Hmm.
the exception to every rule, but in a positive sense. What's interesting is I've seen many times in my clinical practice, we could say like an inverted form of that narcissism, which is the person is an exception to every rule in the negative sense. I will never be loved. I will never be happy. I'm so hopeless that no intervention, not even God himself, could help me. It's like it's still this grandiose exception to every rule. It's just valenced in a negative, self-hating direction. It's very strange, right? And so in both cases, we have at core a really fantastic, unreal sense of self, which is another core component of narcissistic personality disorder. There's a very fragile, illusory sense of self that has been constructed as a defense mechanism against a really vulnerable, wounded child. I can go into that if
Right.
you'd like.
Well, I think yes, because I mean, I was actually going to try and lead us there because this brings to the question like, what creates these personality disorders? Are some people born with them? And I think from my very layperson reading of sociopathy and psychopathy, that it seems to be, from what I've read anyway, that these things can be kind of born into them. That some people are kind of just missing the empathy chip, or that it's somehow inherent to them. Whereas from what I understood, these other ones are based around trauma. So, I mean, if you want to expand on that idea of nature versus nurture within context of personality disorders.
Well, just like any other disorder, there seems to be a nature and a nurture component. And the
Mm.
best that science seems to do is it's around 50-50. Like
Uh,
they haven't gotten much better than that. Like we do see personality disorders being more prevalent in families that have personality disorders, but I do think that they're often created. Like, for example,
mm.
one of the best predictors of borderline in women is having a narcissistic father. And one of the best predictors of narcissism in men is having a borderline mother. Now,
Right.
is that genetic, or does that have to do with how they were raised in that childhood environment for 15, 18 years? It's very difficult to tease that out.
Mm.
But I do think that there also is a theory that borderline personality disorder in particular is actually a kind of a form of complex trauma where I mean, think about it. If your primary caregiver and protector was emotionally unavailable and not in reality, then one way that you as a child could potentially get your needs met was by screaming and acting out and making such a big scene that you couldn't be ignored anymore,
Hmm.
right? And if you had a mother who was behaving that way and was transgressing all kinds of emotional boundaries, what could you do to protect yourself? Create a shell around you where you don't feel anything anymore because it was just this nonstop bombardment of negative emotional chaos, right? So I think you could clearly make an argument that these things are learned and might be trauma responses. I put that in quotes because that's another word that tends to get thrown around a lot these days, like narcissist. So it's lost its kind of clinical meaning.
Well, let's pause on that one as well, because uh, I guess because in my work I'm dealing with men all the time who are carrying levels of trauma, and often they're kind of unaware of it, which will exhibit in problems with feelings of worthiness, or of feeling unlovable or not being enough, or having a lot of social anxiety. So all of these manifestations from these, I guess, programs that are running in the background. But I guess what the way I've come to define trauma is, if it is perceived as traumatic, especially as a child, whether or not it's objectively traumatic, then it can create a trauma. Would you have any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously there are certain things which everyone would agree, child abuse or violence or whatever, which is causes trauma in people, but then of course different people respond to traumatic events in different ways, internalize them different ways, have greater and lesser ability to heal from them. And then, like I think of traumatic events in my childhood. I mean, I had not the best childhood, but not the worst. But being humiliated on stage when I got up to sing a song because I thought that was what would get the girls, which it was. It was just the wrong place, wrong time. But that I think back on that as like one of the more traumatic events, whereas getting beaten up in the schoolyard, which was also sucked, didn't seem to leave as much of an emotional resonance on me throughout life. So yeah, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on what actually makes something traumatic, and how this then is carried, and what the defenses are that we use to then deal with those.
Sure. So there's a lot there. I'm going to try to remember all of my points. So I have a slightly unconventional take on this, which is that there is no such thing as a traumatic event. Maybe I'm just being punctilious with the language here, but that suggests that there is an event in objective reality that its intrinsic nature is that it's traumatizing, which means that I would think anybody who came into contact with it or passed through that experience should be traumatized. And to your point, we see that that's not the case. Some people are very resilient, others less so. People are differentially resilient. You are more resilient to the physical getting beat up than to the emotional experience of being humiliated, right? So another person, it might be the other way around. So it'd be hard to say that being humiliated on stage is a traumatic experience when it is for you, but not for me and not for that guy over there, right? So I think it's important to locate trauma where I see it, which is inside the person who's experiencing it. Trauma is an internal experience. It doesn't belong to external reality. And trauma manifests precisely where we get stuck. Trauma is a freeze response where the person can't move forward in some domain of his life or his emotions or his personality development. It's the freezingness is the trauma, right? That's where I'm getting at. Okay. I also think that there are degrees of trauma, right? The most traumatic event, experiences are the ones that people don't even recognize as trauma. I'll give you an example. I was working with a patient some years back, and he had these reservations about moving forward with his relationship. And so I was like, okay, that's pretty normal. And we talked about the woman in question, and she seemed fine, and they got along great. And he just seemed to was worried about like moving in. And I was like, I mean, I get it. The sex goes down. It's a new stage of the relationship, things like that. But nothing seemed to really hit. And we went through weeks of this. And then one day, kind of casually, he was just like, you know what? Do you think it might have to do with the fact that I saw my father murder my mother
Yes, everything that's going on for you will have
in front of
things
me?
to do with
And
that.
then he killed
Yeah.
himself in our
Oh
living room.
fuck.
Do you think that might have anything to do with
Fucking
it? And I
hell.
was like, there might be something to that. So that's just one very extreme example, but I've seen other manifestations of trauma responses where as a clinician, I'm like, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. Like, I
Hmm.
don't know why this person is getting hung up. And then there's this big reveal and the story begins to make a lot more sense to me, right? So the people who are more conscious of their trauma are actually less traumatized than the ones that aren't. And so it's a good thing to be kind of aware of that. And the
Right,
way to
which is
get
where
through
I
it, go ahead.
sorry, which is where I guess, therapy or psychedelics or, actually investigating yourself is the process that you need to go through to maybe even just uncover the fact that you have trauma at all, like that people can operate walking wounded for decades without having really any conscious understanding of why.
Another thing that happens with that is, especially if it happens in childhood, children just sort of accept the reality which they're given. And so they don't know that anything is bad or wrong until on some level they begin to kind of swap stories with their friends or their girlfriends or other folks, and they're like, "Wait a minute, that didn't happen to you? I just thought that kind of." I thought everyone kind of got the shit beat out of them when their dad came home drunk every night. And it's like, no, dude, that's not it at all. And
Mm.
so, and that's interesting because the folks who tend to go through the most intense trauma and have these intense trauma responses, they often tend to isolate and they sometimes even hide these experiences from themselves. And so it's difficult for them to compare with others to know that this is a non normative experience that might require a little bit more examination.
Hmm.
But ultimately, uncovering it isn't going to heal it. So the way to heal a trauma is to unfreeze it, which means that you have to experience the emotions. And I fucking hate that. Like, I am not somebody who's really big on feeling stuff, but I understand that I don't think there's any way around it. This is not going to sound very scientific, but like, if you don't feel an emotion, it kind of gets repressed and stored somewhere in your body. And I think the way of healing and letting go of some of that is to uncover those memories and feel the frozen emotion that has been encoded inside of you. And the feeling of the emotion is that emotion leaving you. I think of it like vomiting. You're tasting the food again because it's coming up, you know?
Hmm.
So you have to feel it to heal it. That's what they say in therapy. So feeling it is a way of like thawing that frozen emotionality, and eventually you will get through it. Like in the beginning, it's going to feel to some people that if I open that door, the flood is going to come in and I'm just going to drown, and it's going to be nothing but pain and tears and anger. And it might be that way, but I guarantee that no one has ever died from an emotion. They've died from what emotions have made them do. But you can just feel and experience an emotion, and drop by drop, you can empty that bucket. Um, it's not pain. It's not fun, but I don't think there's any way around it.
I definitely absolutely agree because, I've been working with men now for 17 years, and the vast majority of men who come to me have issues with not being able to feel very much. They're just often quite locked up physically, fairly linear with their movements. So it's kind of obvious to me now. I can hear it in their speech patterns, in their gesturing, and then, asking them personalized questions. Like often they don't know what it means to feel an emotion. So, a lot of the work that I've done with guys around getting them into their body, out of their minds, using meditation, using different types of breathing exercises, being able to just express through vocalizing by letting out a sigh. Like you can't imagine how difficult it is to get a man to sigh. Like I do a breath work class, and I'll be like, all right, so breathe in and go, and I hear this, like it's like I have to train these guys to actually just let out a sound that's a kind of a primal or primordial, basic sound that all mammals make, really. And so this then has massive reflection in terms of their ability to engage, to seduce, to be able to communicate with women. Because yeah, if they're locked up and they're only experiencing a very small range of emotions, then it makes it really difficult to actually lock in with somebody else's emotions. And as we know, women like emotions. Not all of them all the time, but we need to be able to elicit and actually share them. So, yeah, I see this in real time all the time. And then over the course of a workshop, seeing the guys loosen up, get more into their body, their voice drops, their eyes, brighten. So yeah, I don't think we can discount how crippling it can be to be unable to feel. And men, I guess, are not really taught that we are able to express it. I mean, maybe anger and competitiveness, but in general, men are not really encouraged to express emotions. So it can be really hard journey for guys to actually let go and express.
Yeah, I agree. From a clinical perspective, I found that if a man does still have access to his emotions, it's most likely to be anger. That's the
Hmm.
one emotion that men seem to retain access to, for better or for worse. And that can be useful because anger, we say, is a secondary emotion. Very few people experience anger primarily, they experience it in reaction to a more primary emotion, which is generally fear or sadness. Think about it like you're driving in a car and someone cuts you off. The first response is, but then as soon as you realize that you're safe, it's like, who the learn to fucking drive, you asshole. So it's like the
Hmm.
anger is actually a relief response to cover up the unbearable terror of the fear response, to also to mobilize towards action once we realize that we're safe. If we realized we weren't safe, we wouldn't become angry.
Yeah.
Anger is actually only a response in safety,
Right.
interestingly enough. So when I posit that to men, they're like, oh, okay, so there might be something behind that. So we can kind of begin to pull some of these other emotions out from behind the anger. I think for a lot of guys, it's grief. C.S. Lewis said that he sat with his anger long enough to know that its real name was grief. I know that's been my personal experience. I've suffered a great deal of loss and death from a young age. So I had a lot of that. I told my therapist at one point that I had this frozen lake of pain inside of me.
Mm,
That's what my subjective experience was. And I had to go through this like somatic experiencing where I had to sit down with my emotions every day. I fucking hated it. And I just had to like feel what there was to feel. And stuff would come up and it would be very confusing because these emotions are from a land far away and a time long ago, right? So they don't make sense. That's another clue to help people get over these issues is a disproportionate emotional response. If you have a reaction that's widely out of proportion to what's going on here, it's probably because it's being layered unconsciously with the memory, um, some sort of pattern recognition that I know what this is about and I'm back in that experience. And so you're now in this liminal kind of borderline space. That's what we talk about with borderline is that it's not like you're seeing things that aren't there, but you're also not fully in reality. There's this unconscious projection on top of it, and you're really responding to that projection without even realizing it. Okay.
hmm Yeah. So if we could swing this back to kind of the male-female dynamic, I think this has been
Sure.
really useful giving some definitions, getting guys thinking in the directions of okay, understanding what these personality disorders are. A lot of the guys that I work with, I would say, are high-achieving nice guys. So, guys who are usually successful in their work or in their business life, usually above average intelligence and fairly analytical in fields like finance and engineering and software and things with numbers and things with machines that you have to make work exactly or they don't work, those kind of jobs. Um, but often can be using the strategy of the nice guy, which is to give in order to try and get, using covert contracts and not really stating their boundaries so clearly. And I've heard many, many horror stories of, guys getting shredded in relationships, not necessarily only the woman's fault, but certainly often with women they probably shouldn't have been with in the first place, and certainly shouldn't have stayed with. Um, I've just recently, come out of a relationship with a very dangerous person, but the day that I found out was the day that it ended, right? The day that I had all my information, all my facts was the day where I was like, okay, this person's out of my life forever. I didn't embroil myself financially with them. I didn't lose a penny out of this. Okay, it wasn't fun, but it is over now. Whereas I've seen so many people, guys, going back into relationships multiple times and getting shredded over and over again, or staying in a relationship that they knew was toxic in some kind of way much longer than they should. Sometimes, what is that because of? It's out of scarcity. It's out of fear of being alone. It's out of empathy, wishing that they can help and change somebody. So maybe if you can talk about this in terms of this kind of common dynamic of the guy that is the nice guy or is a kind person and is in a relationship with somebody that he cares for. But if we have these certain red flags, maybe the first thing you could say is what would be some red flags that you would be really looking out for in a relationship, which are different from just someone else's personality quirks. Someone's a bit annoying sometimes or whatever, like things that are just human stuff. What are certain red flags that a man should look out for in a relationship or at the start of a relationship where it's like, this person might actually be sick, or this person may not actually be aware that their behavior is hysterical or unreasonable or whatever. So maybe we can start there. And then if you could address to a guy that's in that situation, what is it that's going on for him that makes him want to do that? Right? Because I mean, there's a tango dance here. Both parties are involved. It's not all victim, all perpetrator. We do tend to attract or filter for people that line up with our own pathologies or our own needs or our own desires or our own shortcomings. So I think we need to know thyself as if we're going to be able to get in a good relationship. But anyway, I'm asking 8 different questions, so pick one one of those and
You're
we'll go
taxing my
somewhere.
working memory here, James. I'm trying to keep
Yeah, I
them all
know.
in
I'm
my
like
mind.
as I'm like I've already forgotten the first one I asked him. How's he going to remember?
Well, let's start with the red flags. So there's a lot of things that guys can look out for. The first one is probably the one that I is the most important one, but it's the one that I'm most loath to discuss, which is probably the best sign that you're dealing with somebody with a personality disorder in the beginning of a courtship is that it just is too good to be true.
Mm, yes, the love bombing, the sex on demand, all of that, right?
Yeah, because that's an extreme form of giving to get. Like I've worked with a number of people, both men and women, who their conscious goal is to get this person to fall in love with them as quickly as possible. Not because they particularly like or even respect this person, but because it's safe. As soon as that person feels like the other loves them, they can kind of relax because they know they're not going to be leaving. It's an abandonment prevention strategy. So I'm
Right.
going to get this person on the hook as quickly as possible because I know if they're loving me, they're not leaving me, right? And so the other thing, especially with antisocial personality disorder, these folks are chameleons. They are very good at understanding who they need to be in order to win a person's trust and affection.
Mm.
And to be fair, people tell other people what they want to see all the time. They're terrible interviewers. And I talk about this on the channel. Imagine you were an employer trying to hire somebody. You don't just ask a bunch of really obvious direct questions. Are you honest? That's a terrible question to ask in a job interview. It's going to be answered the same way by the honest and the dishonest person,
Oh,
right?
oh,
And by
yes.
coming out of the
Yes is my
what
answer.
yes, exactly. And by coming out of the gate so obviously like that, I'm making it very clear that honesty is important to me, right? So I'm showing my hand. And the more I do that, the more that the cunning applicant can tailor his or her presentation or resume to be exactly what it seems like I'm looking for because I'm basically showing them the cards I'm playing with. So
Hmm.
that's not a very good idea. It's not a good way of collecting good information about another person. Okay. Too many people feel like they can trust in words. Anybody can flap their gums and make air move through their vocal cords, right? So you do want to collect information, but you generally want to collect information indirectly, and you always want to prioritize behavioral data over verbal confession,
Right.
right? So the first red flag is that this is just I don't get like this girl's the hottest girl I've ever gotten with. I mean, she's just so much hotter than any of the girls I've ever been with. She's it's moving really fast. Like the first date was 8 hours long, and we like she shared her trauma with me and I shared mine with her and I felt seen and heard and at the end we said that we loved each other and it's like whoa my god dude it's like just chill.
Mm.
So usually it happens it's too good to be true and it happens way too fast. It doesn't follow normal healthy progression of a relationship. It's like even with a job interview, you want to get a job at Meta or something, you're going to go through 8 rounds of interviews. It's going to take at least 3 months. And that's just to get a job. You know, you want clearance at the FBI, that's 2 years of working without it with background checks and constant supervision. You know what I'm saying? So it's like people get into relationships with all kinds of folks because well, especially with guys, the woman is really hot and she fucks them really good. That's how women hook men, as I've said on the channel.
It's pretty. We just gave the secret away, ladies. If you want to
Oh, and
control
the ladies
us,
hate it. I mean,
use
it's so
sex and
weird.
looks. Oh, you already know that?
I don't understand when I say that it's general, not all women, but it's generally the women who really respond negatively to that. When it's like it should be the men. The men should be calling me up and being like, "Orion, don't tell them where we're vulnerable. Don't tell them our Achilles heel. What are you doing, dude? You're blowing our cover."
I was just as you were talking when you brought up the FBI interview, I just imagined myself going in. They're like, "Right, Mister, was it James Marshall? Look, you can leave now." We're like, "But you just searched my name. Yep, that's all I need to see. Get the fuck out." What did you find? Ah, all
You
right.
know, you could be useful. It reminds me of W. Somerset Maugham. Do you know who that is?
Mm-mm.
He's a British novelist, uh, one of the best dialogue writers I've ever read. That guy understood emotion and subtlety and the repartee and the verbal games better than anybody else in the 20th century, in my opinion. And
Mm.
he is a famous author in his lifetime during World War II, and he was actually approached by MI5, which is like the real life
Oh yes,
James Bond equivalent, to basically be a British spy because he was like this effeminate novelist and he was
dandy.
going on book tours and no one would suspect him. So he actually worked as a secret
Nice.
agent during World War II.
All right, just
So,
putting it out there to all the world's intelligence agencies. It's like, I'm taking
oh, that's
calls.
just James Marshall. He's the sex coach and he travels across the
Yes.
world. Just let him go.
Yeah.
He's doing the Lord's
So
work
how do
here.
these, so guys, how do these missiles work? I mean, not that I'm into them or anything, but so you just, I'll just take a selfie next to, all right, possible career change. Um, it's interesting because you can see how dangerous these kind of opposites can attract, right? Like you've got guys who might be needy, who have built their self-worth on serving people, on being good and loyal and nice, which unfortunately tend to be, if you only have those cluster of traits together, that repels a lot of women because nice guys are perceived to be pushovers. And then this guy finds a girl who seems to be outside of his league, and both their needs link up because he needs to be he desperately wants all of these emotions and for this woman to be devoted to him, and it's all happening so fast. And at the same time, she needs this kind of uh, sponge or person to use, and so you could see how these different people will sync up and cause absolute chaos in each other's lives.
Sure. So other early red flags could be examples of externalizing responsibility for her own emotional state,
All right,
um, denigrating exes. That's kind of a yellow flag because,
some
to your
exes
point,
suck.
anybody could get involved with a dangerous person. They, according to some of the data, probably 10 to 15% of people have personality disorders. Could be even more. So
Mm.
chances are, on a long enough timeline, someone will come into contact with one of these folks. The issue is um, you're not prepared for how crazy it could possibly be. Like it makes soap operas look tame by comparison. Like there is no way that the fictitious representations of personality disorders meet what it's actually the chaos and confusion and despair that come with dating somebody with a personality disorder. And until if you haven't had that experience, this is another kind of red flag that you can it's like something doesn't make sense. That was my experience when this happened to me. It's like I don't get it. I'm a very good communicator. I'm generally a really patient guy. I but like I just can't seem to we keeps running into the same problem over and over again. It's like I thought we talked about this. I thought we came to some sort of understanding and but it just keeps happening. Like I don't get it. Like something seems off here because it's not a normal relationship. Now, to your point, anybody can get involved with one of these folks, but a healthy, high functioning person, once they understand what they're dealing with to some degree, they just say, "Up, not for me. No, thank you." Right? So it's not your fault if you end up getting involved with a dangerous person, but it is kind of your fault if you stay involved with them after things seem to get chaotic or uncertain. There's something about that person that, to my mind, is an unhealed complementary wound that gravitates them towards this dangerous person. I don't think it's just that they're kind hearted and just
No.
a little soft minded. For me, I in my 20s, I dated a lot of unstable, exciting, but disastrous women. I was an actor, so I dated a lot of actresses.
Hmm.
They're known to be a bit histrionic from time to
No,
time.
yes.
Um, and that's also exciting. So that's the other thing that sometimes guys have to come to terms with. I'll talk about that in a minute. But part of the reason why I realized I kept getting involved with those women is because I had this unhealed wounding. I had a pretty low self esteem at that stage in my life. And I didn't think that I deserved sex or relationship or love from a woman. So I had to like earn it. And I earned it by taking on these projects. And they were a little wounded. And
Mm.
like the wounded gazelle, I thought, oh, maybe that's the one I can catch. And maybe I can nurse it back to health. And out of gratitude and the expression of value here, then I can earn my right to have sex and relationship with this particular woman.
Mm. It's
And
like a kind of like a grown-ups Disney movie.
yeah, it's a little bit of a savior complex and probably not very justified because it's not like my life was it wasn't like I was thriving at that stage of my life either. So we both probably weren't entirely in reality, and our unreality was complementary enough that we had this exciting and passionate but ultimately ill-fated relationship. So I do think it's important for some guys to examine, especially if it happens repeatedly, like why am I attracted to this type of a woman? Like, and it's probably because it helps them feel a certain way. Another thing, you see this in codependent relationships, like with alcoholics. Some people like to get involved with problems because it's like the focus is always going to be on them
Right.
and not
So
on my own issues,
right. So
right?
they can be boozing over in the corner because the girlfriend's on smack, and so that seems worse.
Kind of like that, yeah. And what's really interesting about those relationships is you would think that with how destructive and chaotic addiction in general is, that that would be a deal breaker for a lot of relationships. It's not the case. Most relationships fall apart after the addict becomes sober,
Mm,
and they're no longer a problem, and they're no longer injecting that chaos and uncertainty into the relationship, because that chaos and uncertainty was actually keeping the relationship together in some fucked up way.
right.
And the sober partner, it's very difficult for them to understand that they might be codependent. Like there's the addict who's dependent on the substance, and they are codependent on the dynamic of that substance to maintain the cohesion of the relationship. So relationships are fascinating. People are really complex. So it does take a while to understand like what's really going on inside of another person. We never know entirely, right? And in another relationship.
Yeah, and
So
I
too good
think
to be true.
I go on.
Sorry, too good to be true. Happens really fast. Rapid escalation to intimacy seems to be exactly what you want. Like she says the things that you want person to say. But then after it seems like you're kind of on the hook and maybe you've defined the relationship, things start to drop off. And so you start to see a withdrawal of affection. You might see signs of disrespect begin to creep into the communication. That person might actually also be now squaring up their next target, because it's great if if you love me, you're not going to be leaving me, right, James? But so that's a defense against my own abandonment issues. But even more of a defense would be if I had two people who loved me, right?
Yep.
Because something could happen to you, and an heir and a spare. It's good to have a backup. So there's usually, once someone's on the hook, they begin to turn their attention elsewhere, and that can create issues with trust and uh, commitment in the relationship, obviously.
Another thing that I don't know if this is like a clinical thing to look out for, but uh, now I'm much more conscious of seeing if a person is actually has empathy or kindness in them, and I guess it would be not always easy to tell, because if someone is consciously love bombing you in order to try and make you fall in love with them so they can control you for their evil designs, it may appear to be that they're empathetic or kind. But I guess one thing that I tend to look out for in people in general is how do they treat not the boss, not the alpha, not the man that they're trying to get the attention of, but how do they treat service staff or a puppy on the street, or like to actually see, do they have any kind of empathetic response? Just before I pass it over to you, because this brought up something that happened in this recent relationship of mine. Uh, I put a sticky trap for spiders, right? So a thing that catches spiders in her house because she was scared of the spiders, because we live in the countryside and there's spiders, but they're pussy little spiders, pussy little Portuguese spiders. They're not even
Yeah,
spiders.
compared to Australia, man.
Nah, it's not a
Jeez.
fucking spider. It's got 8 legs. So what? Look at this. It's only this big. It's fucking nothing. Anyway, so she didn't like them. So anyway, I put this trap, and then I went one day, and there was very unfortunately a bird and 2 lizards had gotten stuck to this thing and died. Right, and I was like, oh fucking hell,
Oh dear.
fuck. And then I was like, all right, we're throwing those things out. And she said, why are you throwing it out? I said, well, because it's just killed these animals, and I don't want it to. And she looked confused, right? And there was just a moment where I went, she doesn't care about that spider, about those lizards and that bird. Like that means nothing to her. It was just in terms of like little thing where I'm like, she doesn't feel sad for the little bird. So I don't know if it's as an example of like things that can pop up where you're like, oh, this person actually doesn't care about other people. That's something that I mean, it's personally for me, it's an important trait that I would want in any given partner, except sometimes for the crazy chicks where it doesn't matter because you know you're going into crazy. What do you think about that in terms of empathy or having a conscience or feeling what other people feel? How important that
Sure.
is?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I don't think that most borderlines or narcissists are actually having evil designs. Maybe you were just exaggerating for
A bit
effect there.
hyperbolic, yes.
Obviously, some of them do, but that's when their defensive strategies get combined with, let's say, exploitativeness, and they're manipulating in order to get your money or to get access to a certain opportunity, or like they're really throwing you under the bus for their own concrete advantage. Most narcissists and borderlines are causing chaos or problems in their relationships, but they're doing it because they're as a defensive strategy to protect against the fear of abandonment or exposure to the wounded, bleeding boy that's at the heart of most narcissistic disorders. Okay. So I just want to say that. So unless it's actually coupled with exploitativeness, it can feel evil, but I don't think these people are just kind of flailing sometimes, and that can come off obviously as very destructive, but I don't think it's quite right to ascribe malice to that.
Because that would tip over into antisocial personality disorder, which is
Yeah,
known
and
as
antisocial,
sociopathy or
you do need to have
psychopathy,
the
right?
exploitative element to some degree, and that's a really dangerous person to be
Yeah.
dealing with, obviously. Yeah, and these are can be comorbid. Like I said, there's a lot of overlap between disorders of the same cluster.
Yeah.
Uh, Absolutely, you want to test for a woman's empathy, and there's probably ways that you can do that without endangering lizards and birds
Yeah.
as well. So there's a really simple trick that I use, which is fairly early in the courtship process. I'll cancel a date and say that I'm not feeling well. And if the response is, oh my God, what's going on? Do you need anything? That's
Hmm.
on one extreme. Versus
Hmm.
what I've also gotten is, how selfish. Like, it's 2 hours before our date. Like, I canceled my plans. And now what am I supposed to do tonight?
Mm.
So that person never gets another date at that point to me.
Yeah.
So women test men all the time. Men have derogatory names for those testing, right? They call them shit tests. But I think it's very fair and valid for
Mm.
men to test women as well. I have an episode coming out about this very soon. The issue is that so many guys, due to their poor optionality, they don't think to do that. They're just happy to be there. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
And they only begin to potentially consider. I mean, why even consider if this isn't a good fit if you don't have any other options? You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
It's
So,
that's the
frankly,
suit on the
the
rack,
more
and it's
options
the
you
only one
have, the
there is.
pickier you can be. Sorry, I talked over you.
Oh,
What did you say,
yes.
James?
Oh, no, we both, who's to say who talked over who? Yes, if there's only one option in the shop, then you'll take that one, whether it fits or not. Um, the kind of funny thing about that is, as you get more options, you both have more more decision power in terms of what you do and don't want in your life, but you are also more likely to come across people who have got, let's say, personality disorders, because as I've seen in my life, as I've become more powerful, more rich, more effective socially, have higher status, I've attracted more of everything. Both incredibly beautiful, wonderful women and some like A grade psychos. Because I'm moving through a number of, more than the average man's number of women, and because I'm potentially a target for certain types of women.
I hear you. Now, I think this might be interesting, especially in the context of women and personality disorders. So, I believe, and a number of theorists believe as well, that everyone starts out narcissistic. Like the infant's only way of understanding the world is that it's just the self. I'm all that exists. It can't even see three dimensions yet. So it's just its own proprioceptive experience, and everything is self-referential. He feels cold and cries, and some godlike creature comes and puts a blanket on him. He feels hungry and cries, and the nipple appears. So he also has this sense of like infantile omnipotence, that he can like conjure all of his needs effortlessly to him. So there's this sense that everything is self-referential. He has this sort of omnipotence, and children are tyrants. Like they don't we don't talk about this very often, but you cannot reason with the child. You can't even communicate really with the child, right? It is a force of nature. It's cold when it's cold. It needs to eat when it's hungry. It needs to shit when it does. It's like it doesn't care about your schedule. It doesn't care about your lifestyle. It is the most powerful person in the household for at least a time, right? So we might all start out in this sort of narcissistic perspective. And in normal development, we get disabused of that by stages as we grow up. We realize that we don't always win, that sometimes people are more skilled than us, or that we're not as smart as other people. Our parents do have to start saying no to our requests. We can't just demand every desire be fulfilled immediately, right? And most of us eventually get to some sort of healthy balance, which is, I'm not the worst in the world. I'm not the best in the world. I can do some things right. I can do some things wrong. I can't always get what I want, but if I try sometimes, I just might find I get what I need, kind of a
get
thing,
what you need.
right? So that's a normal person. But some children are not disabused of that narcissism. This is because either the child is just way too difficult or the parents are too weak. And they throw the tantrum and the parents try to resist, but they eventually give in. So what those parents are functionally doing is training a monster for later on in life. This feeling that I am entitled to receive everything that I want because I've never not received anything that I didn't want. And especially young women, because this is really nurtured in the house, in the home. 19 to 22, they're just having their first experiences kind of outside of that. And so, of course, they're assuming that life outside the home is going to be functionally equivalent to life inside the home. It's like, I've always gotten what I wanted, so why shouldn't I continue to always get what I want? That doesn't make any sense. And it's usually women, because for better or for worse, I don't think we have as much trouble telling men no than women, especially if the women are beautiful. So I remember with one of the disordered women that I was involved with some years ago, she told me that I was the first man in her life who ever told her no. And
Yep.
she was 23.
Yep.
Dad never told her no. I'm sure he tried, but he couldn't deal with the hatred and the pouting and the cruelty that came out of her in response to that boundary. And he caved. Her brother couldn't tell her no for the same reason.
Yep.
They decided they'd rather have some measure of relationship than to withstand that kind of emotional violence. It's like the child is doing whatever it can to manipulate those who have the power, the parent, to hand over the toy or to take away the chore or the responsibility. Like, no bones about it. There's no below the belt for kids. They don't know rules for that kind of stuff. They can go for the jugular.
Exactly. Which is why I don't have any yet. Yeah, and it's interesting though. We see this often with particularly beautiful women, is that they have been continually trained by men. Because I'm when I come across entitled women, or guys can complain about entitled women, I feel like that's men's fault, in the sense
It
that
is.
if she goes out and demands things or passively accepts things that are given to her all the time, and men are expecting nothing much more than that she's there and maybe smiles and hope that they're going to get access to her, that they'll put up with all sorts of shitty behavior, encourage that behavior, actually give her plenty of things, whether that's actually physical objects or attention or time or money or support or whatever it is that men try and trade. And she realizes that the currencies that these guys are giving me are cheap, because I can get lots of them, and what I have to give in return is extremely valuable in this within this marketplace out here. So therefore, my entitlement continues to raise until, as you said, she meets a man who says, "No," or "None of that," or "Settle down," or "Don't do that around me, otherwise this is going to end very quickly." And that's actually a beautiful shock for a lot of women to receive, and it's actually doing them a great favor because
They don't
she
see
then
it that
gets
way, though.
well, they may not initially, and some of them may storm out in a huff or go off and fuck someone else to get revenge, but some of them may also change their behavior. Because that's where I want to kind of, we'll wrap things up soon, but I wanted to swing this around to, firstly, I wanted us, because we've talked, quite a bit about personality disorders, what to look out for, some of the awful effects that this can have in your life. How does a man navigate this whilst not becoming completely paranoid and so hardcore red pill that because I already know there's going to be some comments with guys like, yeah, all men have got personality disorders and better off going MGTOW and paying prostitutes, that kind of thing. I'm sure we'll get a couple of those comments. Most of my guys are not like that, but some are. So how is it that you can navigate with both not being completely naive and being a pushover and being tricked and having your life turned upside down by someone who is ill in some kind of way, whilst at the same time not becoming, a woman hating, paranoid person that can't trust anybody and is always thinking that the worst is going to happen. Because obviously
Hmm.
that can lead to manifesting that kind of thing as well. If you go into interactions with women thinking that they're all liars and evil and manipulative and they've all got personality disorders, then you're going to not come across very sexy, that's for sure.
Well, you're also very ambivalent because if you truly believe that through and through, why are you approaching women?
Mm.
I mean, that man needs to resolve his own
Well,
inner
often they don't
division because
actually.
he's still
Yeah.
attracted. He still wants to approach. He still wants something, but he has this conscious belief about these women. And so I mean, those two things are contradictory. And
Mm.
you're right, he's not going to have a lot of success. And that's probably for the best because I'm not sure if he's in a position to have a kind of healthy, fulfilling relationship with a woman. Now, I made an episode about the red pill a long time ago, and one of the things that I discuss is like if you, it takes a while to really understand some of these things about intersexual dynamics, evolutionary psychology, um, what men and women actually select for, what they do behind closed doors, not what they say publicly.
Mm.
It takes a long time to integrate those understandings and to make peace with them. And so when guys are just like angry, I say that they're choking on the red pill. Like they've swallowed it to an extent, but it's like here and it's like you got to keep swallowing it. And it's going to take some time to digest it and to actually integrate that into your worldview in a healthy, effective, sustainable way. But I don't know if you can just like whoop completely bypass the throat. For some guys the pill gets stuck in their throat for a long time, but sometimes it's a very short time, right? But it does seem like maybe the pendulum does have to swing the other way, and maybe it has to swing to the extent that they might have been like naive and idealistic in their previous life.
Hmm.
And I think that one of the dangers is they become paranoid or women hating. Another of the dangers is they become a player. I made an episode about that too. It's like, where do players come from? They were nice guys who were just tired of not getting the girl. And
Guilty.
out of that pain, they were like, if I knew what worked, I would have had it by now. I am now going to let effectiveness and outcomes guide my behavior as opposed to some ideology that I'm going to impose on women and reality. And they become behavioral psychologists of female sexuality. And you can get really good at understanding probabilistically how women are going to respond to certain prompts. And you can fall down that hole for a while. And I think that there's good things and bad things about that. Like I think it's very useful for men to know what women actually respond to and to have sort of the knowledge that they could make something happen if they needed slash wanted to. But I've also seen guys get just like locked in the habit of pickup. Like they don't even know what they want a woman for anymore, but they're just like, I got to have options, got to keep fucking, and that's a trap too. So there, like this is a labyrinth, and there's lots of ways that men can get lost, and only a few different ways out, right? So,
Mm.
but the alternative is to potentially stay naive and and to just keep hoping against hope that the same old behaviors are going to have different results,
Yeah.
which I don't think is reasonable.
No, and tends to lead to bitterness, basically, which that's the most common thing I see with nice guys
Well,
who won't change is that they feel like the world has stolen something from them, that they've
well,
tried
what
so
is
hard and they haven't gotten what they deserve.
what is bitterness, James? It's a variety of anger, right?
Mm.
And there's there's a few different organic pathways to anger, and one of the organic pathways to anger is that you are obstructed in a personally relevant goal. That's like what frustration means literally. It's like I want something and I can't get it, right? And so you have to understand that anger is like a public confession of your own ineffectiveness. When you become angry, you're basically communicating to everyone around you, I can't get what I want. I don't know how to do it. I feel impotent right now. Like I want it. I can't surrender the desire, but I also don't have the skills to achieve it. So
Mm.
it's a bad look. Anger is always a bad look because you're just like telegraphing your own impotence and ineffectiveness. But like, okay, maybe you'll get less angry once you become more effective. And I find that to be the case, for a lot of guys.
Yeah.
Like when once you finally find a way around that obstacle and you get what you want, this is nice. That's satisfaction.
That's really interesting. I never heard anger kind of phrased in that way. And it makes me think it's interesting how men are taught, like in pretty much every unrealistic action movie, suddenly the hero gets a boost of anger at the end. Like, and anger is the superpower, and that somehow makes him more effective. It's like he was getting beaten down, but then he just gets a bit angry, and then that suddenly is way better at shooting his Uzis or whatever. I think, yeah, men have this probably, let's say, immature understanding of what this emotion is good for and what it's not for. It's
Well,
like
I,
a
I did.
spice, right? Which can be used just delicately at certain points in your life to act with clarity and decisiveness and get something done or defend yourself or whatever. But for the most part, it is really an impotent feeling.
I agree with that. I made a video a while back called The Force of Revenge. So this isn't quite the same thing as anger. It's a more chronic, protracted sentiment. But I think I don't know a single very successful man who doesn't or didn't have at one point a chip on his shoulder because little Susie didn't say yes to him to go to the dance or because he was humiliated on stage. I'm not saying that's you, but it's like there's something that it's like I'm going to show them, whether it's my parents or the girls in high school or the guys on the football team who mocked me for being small and weak. It's like I'm going to become so successful and powerful that they're going to understand how wrong they were. And I'm going to have my revenge on the people who invalidated me, who mocked me, who disrespected me. And that is a fucking powerful fuel. Like the force of revenge is actually, it will burn long enough and hot enough to achieve escape velocity. Like you can actually leave the planet on revenge. The issue is the longer you rely on that force, especially after you're in orbit, the more pathetic you appear. Like you don't want to be a 60-year-old guy who's still trying to get back at dad who's been dead in the ground for the last 20 years. You know what I'm saying? It's like little Susie hasn't thought about you in 5 decades, dude. It's like, let it go. So it's good to get out of Earth's gravitational field, but I do think that people need to find another compelling fuel to motivate them to the stars. And I don't think revenge can do that, but it
No.
can certainly get people off the ground.
Yeah, and that brings back to that kind of pendulum metaphor of it's that at certain points in your life, yeah, maybe you need a type of fuel, which is maybe it's kind of immature, but in the long run, it's going to be pathetic, but it is something that gets you moving. Because I mean, I know for myself, for sure, my early motivations in getting good at pickup was that a total nerd and dork in high school and didn't get the girls and had that chip on my shoulder, absolutely, without question. And it did get me moving. It got me quite successful, but it certainly burnt out at some point where I had to then reconsider. Okay, why am I still doing this? What is this actually serving me anymore? Am I doing it for reasons of trying to prove myself out of ego? And saw that yes, that was the case, and then had to adapt and shift into a different, more mature masculine motivation.
It's been enormously helpful in my life. I think the periods of most accelerated self growth have been for me after a heartbreak.
Mm,
And I think at some level initially it was, I'm going to make my ex regret leaving me. And I'm going to
yeah.
become so much better that they're going to see what they missed out on, kind of a thing. And I grew and changed and leveled up, and I met someone even a better fit for me. And I, don't harbor that kind of fantasy in my imagination anymore. But it was
Mm.
useful for a time.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap this up. This has been fascinating. I know we could just rant for another 3 hours straight without any problem at all. But I'm conscious that we need to present this to the planet in a digestible format. So I'll put it up, and guys, if you want to see more of Orion, then put lots of comments saying that, and then I will twist his arm to come back and join us again. And if there's any topics that the guys want to hear from you about, if you feel free to put them in the comments, and if Orion's feeling generous, he may jump on and join us again.
I'd love to. I really like this conversation because it just went beyond some of the basic stuff about intersexual dynamics and pickup. And we were really actually getting into some psychology stuff, which
Yeah.
obviously I geek out on and love to
Well, that's
discuss.
that's that's what I wanted you here for, to pick your brains, because I think there's not enough men's psychologists who are men.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, you would know that within your industry, it's mostly women, I think.
Hmm.
And so many men are in pain, possibly unconscious of why or even the what. I see that in my work all the time. That when at the end of the day, what I teach is relatively simple. Like, I'm not teaching complex algorithms or rocket science. It's like, go over there, wave, say, "Hi, you're looking great today. What's your name?" Or some variation upon that is not difficult to do. It's A child can do that. It's objectively really simple actions. Yet for so many men, it's terrifying. It's mortifying because it's not about the actual skill. I mean, of course, there's better and worse ways to do the thing and say the things. But so much of what's holding guys back is these fears of worthiness or of unprocessed traumas that just be humming away in the background for a lifetime and really cripple somebody. So I think it's really important that guys like us who in the manosphere, I guess, but far from the kind of hardcore misogyny that can exist within this realm, and also far away from very simplistic cookie cutter, just do this XYZ thing and it'll work. I think that, as you said, that humans are so complex, and there is so much variety in the way that we're formed and our individual makeup, and it's a lifelong journey, or at least many years journey, to actually understand yourself. But it's something that's vitally important to do, because if you don't, you will be doomed to repeat those same old patterns.
Freud said that you have two options. You can remember or you can repeat.
Well, okay, I'm going to ponder that one for a while. All right,
But I've
so
loved your work for a long time, James. I refer folks to your channel all the time when guys want practical guidance on how to approach a girl or how to escalate towards a sexual encounter. It's like there's not a lot of good, non creepy, practical advice out there. And I think you balance it with healthy masculinity and not just the sense of, well, we're going to plow through half the town. Come join me, gents, and get some notches in your belt. And I think that has to do with some of your personal experiences, as far as I can tell, in spirituality and meditation, and coming about this as a whole person instead of just like a disembodied dick trying to get inside of a vagina.
exactly. Thank you. I'll definitely take that. I'll take that compliment. All right, and so for guys who on my crew who've just come in contact with you, they can find your YouTube channel, which is Psych Hacks, Psychh. You spell it,
Only one
just in
H.
case.
So
Just the one.
P S
I'll
Y
link. I'll
C
link it in
H
the
A
description.
C. KS.
And highly recommended. I don't watch a lot of other men's content, but I do actually watch yours by choice for fun, and I've learned a lot. So guys, I can highly recommend Orion's work. And if you're looking for a male therapist, that, well, actually you're booked out now. If you want to get on the waiting list to have him as your therapist, I would recommend that as well. Maybe I'll join the list. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, and no doubt we'll talk very soon. I look forward to us hanging out in person and causing some kind of trouble in the future, which I feel like is
great, man. Let's do it.
I've got a feeling that's going to happen. So guys, in the comments, you can also add what types of trouble that me and Orion should get up to when we hang out. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, James. It was a pleasure.
All right, guys. We'll see you in the next video. James Marshall and Orion Taraban signing out. Peace. Good day, gentlemen. Happy New Year. Hope you enjoyed today's video with the one and only Orion Taraban. I enjoyed it. If you'd like more from him, comments in the description what you'd like us to talk about, and I'm sure I can get him back because he's a rad individual. So, if you'd like to make 2025 the year where you get your dating life sorted, then you should consider joining me and my world-class team for one of our live workshops coming up in the spring and summer. The first workshop in Budapest is already sold out, and the Lisbon workshop in May is half sold out. So, you better get moving. Click the link in the description below, get on a free call with one of my team, have a chat to us, and see if we can help you out. Hopefully we'll see you in one of the workshops coming up very soon, and if not, see you in the next video. Peace.